Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I know there are still several folks coming through, but we've got a pretty full agenda, so I'm going to get us going. My name is Kathy Boyce. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I am the Director for the Interior West for GridWorks, and I'm joined by my colleagues Steve Black and Matt Jones, and we will be providing facilitation support for today's meeting. This is the second study session for the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority and related to project prioritization. This is an outgrowth of CETA's 2024 transmission study. We are here to introduce the technical results of the project prioritization work and provide time for questions and initial reactions. We are recording this meeting and we'll be posting that on the CETA website shortly, and all meeting materials, including the slide deck and the maps and the scorecard that we will be sharing with you, all of that can be found on the CETA website. And Matt, thank you, just dropped the link into the chat for you. So we will provide time during the study session for both board directors and stakeholder questions. For now, though, I'll ask folks to keep themselves muted, and we'll invite speakers at different points throughout the session. So please hold your questions until the appropriate time. And with that, I will hand it over to Maury Galbraith, the CETA Executive Director.
Thank you, Kathy. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to see almost 50 people on the call. That may be a new record, so thank you for taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate that. We're going to dive into the slide deck here. If I could get Matt to go ahead one slide forward. The purpose of this study session today is to introduce the results of the technical analysis that has been performed to support the board's prioritization of the 2024 transmission study projects. We're going to have, as Kathy said, plenty of time for questions and initial reactions from both CETA board members and the general public. So just be patient, bear with us, and we'll open it up to questions here momentarily. And it's also an opportunity for us to announce a public comment period for stakeholders to submit substantive feedback on a potential project shortlist for CETA. But the most important thing is that we are not making any decisions today at this study session. The purpose of today's meeting is simply to review the results and get everybody up the learning curve and speaking the same language. Like I said, we are going to be opening up a public comment period, and comments will be due by June 26th. So let's cover some ground as to where we've been and where we're headed. So next slide, Matt. So CETA's statutory mission is to plan and develop electric transmission in Colorado. There are some significantly long lead times in developing transmission, and the complexity of doing so is pretty high. CETA has completed a need assessment of transmission in Colorado, looking out 20 years. We have identified over 40 specific transmission projects that we're going to be talking about today and attempting to prioritize. We have an awful lot of project due diligence that's ahead of us. This is just, we're still at a very early stage. We're simply trying to identify projects where we can signal that we're interested in these projects. Hopefully other partners will come forward, reach out to us, and indicate that they're also interested, and we'll be able to start working on some of that further due diligence. But there is an urgency to narrow the field of candidate projects so that we can start having some of those enabling conversations. If you move to the next slide, you'll see I mentioned that there's over 40 projects that are under consideration. Those projects came out of the 2024 transmission study, which we're calling a need assessment. You'll recall that the reference case portfolio in that transmission study that looked at reliability and deliverability issues identified over $4.5 billion of investment over the next 20 years. There was a fairly significant number of projects that were greenfield projects, but in terms of overall line miles, the vast majority of the projects identified were rebuilds or reconductoring. There was a series of scenarios in that study in addition to the reference case portfolio. There was a set of conceptual alternatives that CETA could consider as alternatives to the reference case that sort of met the same needs, but are best thought of as alternatives to reference case projects. There was a series of interstate concepts, projects that would better interconnect Colorado with its neighboring states and potentially with wholesale electricity markets. There was a high demand scenario that anticipated significant data center load growth, significant electrification of the transportation industry. And so there was a bunch of projects associated with that high demand scenario. And then there were several projects associated with using HVDC to cross the interconnection boundary and bring wind into Colorado from SPP. All of those projects are up for consideration in today's discussion, and those are the projects that total more than 40 concepts. So you'll recall that we met probably a little over a month ago to talk to you about a filtering and prioritization strategy. We worked on developing criteria that CETA can use to screen and rank projects. We're hoping that screening framework is a durable framework that we can use in the future. So one of the questions that we would like stakeholders to address when you're submitting written comments is whether or not you find the methodology that we have used to screen and rank projects to be effective. And if you have any suggestions for improving it, we're open to hearing those. We want this methodology to support the CETA board in its decision making. In other words, it's really important to understand that the scorecard and the ranking simply informs the board. It is ultimately the board that exercises its judgment in selecting a short list of projects. And you'll recall that we're attempting to identify a best fit short list of projects for CETA. These are projects that would be good for CETA to champion and move forward. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the screening and scoring criteria that we have established. It's a two-stage process. The initial stage is a pass or fail test. All of the projects must meet the 4 criteria shown on the left. There must be alignment with CETA's statutory mission. The projects must be technically feasible. They must have geographical relevance, and they must be a good fit for CETA. So if a project fails any one of those 4 criteria, it does not move on to stage 2. The stage 2 is a scoring and ranking process. We identified 10 factors that we are going to score each of the projects on, and we score projects on a 0 to 3 scale, with 3 being high and 0 being poor. And so that's where we left things off about a month ago. In the intervening time, CETA has been working with the team at Energy Strategies to apply this methodology. So we now want to turn to Keegan Moyer with Energy Strategies to walk you through the results of the screening and scoring. So Keegan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Maury. And as usual, I've got Tom Green on the line with me, and he'll supplement anything that I have to say. So we were asked to apply, help develop and then apply the screening and scoring criteria. If you want more background on this, I believe there's a memo out there somewhere on the CETA website, and maybe Kathy or somebody can link that in the chat. We're not going to repeat. That's kind of what the last presentation to the board was going through these line item by line item and getting some feedback. This presentation is more of the results of that application of those. So if you want that background, it's available in that memo. So if you go to the next slide, in applying this, we've got some perspectives, I'll call it, before we share the results. And these perspectives are primarily oriented as advice, really take it or leave it, for the CETA board and in thinking about how to interpret this analysis and how to think about its next steps. So as the board kind of walks forward in trying to develop a short list of elevated projects, one of the things that we want to recommend is to focus on that goal and keep in mind that a small portfolio of projects right now doesn't mean that this is the extent of the scope that CETA will be working on, likely. And that we do recommend, I kind of characterize it as more than one and less than 10, some number of projects in there. And the reason that we recommend a portfolio of projects is that I think everybody on the board obviously wants CETA to be successful in fulfilling its mission. And the portfolio approach recognizes that some of these projects are just going to go into an additional diligence phase, and there are more reasons than a project will fail than a project will succeed sometimes. So I would expect that some of these projects likely will not pass that diligence phase. Maybe they don't pass the diligence phase because after further analysis, more than what we could do here, we find that there's really just not a commercially viable path forward to pay for the costs that it requires to build and operate the project. Maybe that's the reason. There could be any number of reasons related to routing and other risks, right, that are identified at that diligence stage. It's also true that some of these projects could fail, post diligence and into the development phase. You get into a whole host of issues there. So a small portfolio is recommended to help kind of de-risk the proposition of these next steps. So the other thing that we've thought about some and thinking about how CETA should think about this is this portfolio development phase for further diligence is a next step. It's not the last step for the organization. So recognize, first of all, the projects you put in it at this stage are lightly scoped, right? These are project concepts. Some of them we've kind of said, hey, we think this is a greenfield upgrade. We think this is a rebuild. Those can and will change frequently in the course of refining these projects and moving them through the development cycles. They can change the entire routing, for instance, could look entirely different. And so expect those things to change, especially in that early development phase before the project scope is ultimately finalized. So there's a lot of room for iteration once you do pick the list still. And this isn't the end of the project selection process. I think the intent here was to stand up a way to do this and apply it to a discrete set of projects. My understanding is that if a great opportunity walked through the door, June 6th, it's not like Maury would say, no, we just completed this process and we're done with this forever. We're never going to pick a new project. I think I don't think that's the objective of this. We're just applying it to a discrete list. And then finally recognize that the selection of this project shortlist isn't the extent of what CETA can do to support transmission deployment in the state. There's a lot of, obviously, policy efforts, supporting proposals by others, right? And maybe kind of alternative roles. A lot of things that could be done supporting the reconductoring of projects across the state. That doesn't necessarily mean all those are going to fall into this list of these elevated projects for further diligence and development. So in applying this analysis we've done, we're observing two things that are going to be really important. One is the CETA board thinking very deeply about strategic fit. What does it make sense for CETA to take on? And also thinking about what we're calling planning themes. Both of these things we think are important, and that'll probably be evident as to why as we move through the slide deck. But what you'll find is, I think, a need for the CETA board to think about, okay, be developed but for CETA, or what projects are likely to be developed by others just through the course of time, right? Or what types of projects, rebuilds or reconductors or greenfield fit best with the organization. Those things, and also what needs of the state. Do you want to go for some of the legacy upgrades, the grid issues that have kind of been known to be hampering the state for many, many years, that are just, a thorn that perhaps CETA is the right organization to take those on, or are these maybe projects that are visionary that would jump out in time and try to anticipate a need that would be evolving over time? These are the types of planning themes you'll see in the following slides. The other thing that we thought about in selecting projects from the list is ensuring portfolio diversity. There's a lot of different projects on here. They've got probably different development timelines, significantly different costs, therefore significantly different risk profiles, and different, I think, routes towards commercial feasibility. We don't recommend adopting kind of like a single project archetype where it's, you know, hey, this all looks the same geographically even, right? I think it makes sense to have a diverse portfolio when that is developed. And finally, we think the scorecard is not an answer, right? If there was expectations that we would just apply the criteria and scoring that Maury went over on the last slide, and it would just be obvious what to do. If that was the case, I think with transmission, we wouldn't have so much debate in the industry as a whole, which projects to pursue. But, you know, there's an entire planning environment that's kind of built around trying to decipher which of these things to move forward. And, you know, this is no different. So this scorecard really is just supportive of conversations, I think. And it doesn't mean that, you know, a project with a score of 20 could ultimately be the project that, you know, makes more sense to the CETA board than a project with a score of 25 or something like that. And there's no rules or hard and fast lines here. So with that, I'm going to jump into what we produced. So if you can go to the next slide here. So we produced this detailed scorecard. This is linked there. I think Matt might have just linked it. It's available as a PDF. Because we had so many criteria, it's as small as it is. Had we had fewer, it would be bigger. That's really the only reasons that it's this small in terms of its font, but you can download it and pull it up. The intent of this slide isn't to show the document or any of the analysis. It's just to give you a sense of what it looks like. And what you're going to see when you go and pull this up is a few pieces of data about each of the project concepts. It'll talk about the study that it came from. Maury mentioned we did some conceptual analyses. We did a reference case, a couple scenarios. So it'll talk about that so you know what the driver was. It'll talk about the type of project, if we're hypothesizing it as a greenfield or rebuild or reconductor. It'll give the name of the project, which is really just the terminus, where it's located, in a short description. The description is kind of the elevator pitch. What does this project do in a couple sentences? And then we provide some information about the miles and costs. And then we begin to apply the pass-fail criteria as well as the stage 2 scoring. And then to the extent we had any comments that were, you know, occurred to us in doing that scoring, we provide those in the right column. So that's available. I'll show the ranking in the next slide here. But what we saw when we went through this is some emerging planning themes. And that's, I think, the right way to think about this list, is thinking about the projects that fit into these. And so these are the themes we've observed. I'll talk about them in some coming slides, but what I'm getting at from a recommendation standpoint is the CETA board picking from these themes is just as important as the CETA board looking at the scores on the rightmost side of this analysis. Go to the next slide if you can, Matt. So this is where the scoring fell out. I think we evaluated 40 plus projects. A handful of them, primarily reconductoring projects, didn't pass the screening. We ended up with detailed scores for 36 projects. The median score, I think, is around 22. And the high score, I think, is around 27 or so. This is, I think, informational. So you can go and look at these lines, look at these scores, and it gives the layman, so to speak, an ability to kind of look at how one of these projects scores against the other. That's really it, right? You saw what the criteria were, what we scored them about. This doesn't say anything other than that. So the way we hope this can be used is we think there's some valuable data in that scoring workbook, but we also think the CETA board can start thinking about what areas, what planning themes are a priority. And so we've organized some of those. So if you can go to the next slide here, I'll talk about that briefly. And what you'll see is a new map that we've made. This really summarizes the projects that we scored. So this has a mix of the conceptual and reference case projects in it. Doesn't really suggest this is the only plan for the state. I wouldn't even call this map a plan. It's just a map of the project concepts that we evaluated. And so I'm going to walk through these. So if you can go to the next slide. One of the planning themes that came up that was evident was a combination. We kind of blended these two together. Was the San Luis Valley, which is, you know, a known transmission issue in Colorado for decades, and this east-west capacity need. So the study did identify an opportunity to expand this east-west corridor. There is some overlap and synergy with expansion of the San Luis Valley corridor, provided a northern route is selected. One of the things I want to point out here is we do recognize that in this, as you know, speaking to the San Luis Valley, there are a number of alternatives that are on the table. The CETA study arrived at one, right? So we've renamed that project San Luis Valley Alternatives because we're really not prejudging any outcome there, just saying that this is the one that the study focused on. So this is the first planning theme. I'm gonna pause here. Tom, do you have anything that you want to add as I go through these themes?
Yeah, no, as you mentioned, you know, Keegan, the themes are also a chance to, you know, give the board some ideas for further consideration. You know, these are themes that we saw. There may be other themes. As you go through the project list, you might see particular projects that you think should fall into, you know, a theme that we didn't pick. But again, it's more for conversation purposes that way. We identified this one in particular. We decided to throw the San Luis Valley into this east-west. I probably should have called it west-east because chances are that's how the power would likely flow, depending on what you did on the western slope. But yeah, I think we captured this one pretty well. As Keegan mentioned, you know, we understand that, you know, some folks are considering other alternatives than the traditional San Luis to Poncha that we showed on here, but this is the one that we evaluated.
So one of the things that the board can do is we don't have the scores on here, but what the board could do in theory would be to consider this area, consider it as a priority relative to the other areas, and then after having done that, consider the scores, consider your perspective on that scoring, which may be different than what we did, and perhaps drive towards an outcome in that manner. So that's an example of how to use this work. Go to the next slide. This next theme is, we're calling it system connectors. These generally are on the east side of the system, and there are issues that came up in the reference case analysis for our 20-year planning study that we did last year. And all of these upgrades are similar in that they're relatively short and relatively low cost. And a number of them scored fairly well in our analysis. And so what these projects represent is kind of intermingling and kind of intergrid efficiencies on the system. And so this was a unique set of upgrades that came out of our study work and that are scored and summarized in that workbook. Tom, do you have anything you want to add for these?
There are a lot of projects that could be considered connectors, but we just wanted to highlight these because they do kind of point out the advantages for connecting the planned Colorado Power Pathway with some of the existing system, which we found an advantage in the studies that we did.
This next set, if you go to the next slide, is the set of interstate expansion projects. So one of the themes or one of the focus areas of the planning study was to look at those projects. So these were all scored. So there's kind of 4 different projects. The 2 southern projects are really alternatives to each other. And we looked at these and summarized them in the scoring workbook. I will say that I believe the Craig Coyote line of these scored the highest, and they're all shown there. So these would be upgrades where, you know, if the CETA board was focused on, okay, we're going to do a set of projects within the state, but we also want to have as a part of our portfolio an interstate project, you know, this is the sheet that you would turn to get some more information on those projects that we evaluated in the study and then ultimately scored in that workbook.
I'll just say we were really intrigued by that, you know, the Craig to Coyote, in terms of the bang for the buck, I guess you could say. You know, I like the ones to the south, the southeast. Connections to New Mexico would be great, but unless there were additional transmission built across New Mexico, northern New Mexico in particular, not sure that you'd realize, you know, the kind of benefit from those projects that you would for like the Craig Coyote. The other little circle on there, those are of you that are familiar with that goes across the Wyoming to Colorado border, known as Tote 3, and that's just has more hair on it, I guess I would say, in terms of, you know, the issues that might be associated with trying to upgrade that path. It's a great objective, but I'll just say of those that we listed here, that Craig to Coyote seemed to provide the most benefit.
Thanks, Tom. Next slide. This next group of projects really is just a reinforcement to the backbone grid that runs across the Eastern Plains. We call this the Eastern Resource Access suite of upgrades. Some of these were conceptual from our study. Some of them were in the reference case. In all cases, they generally work together to enhance access to the kind of rich solar and wind resources and help to bring them into the outskirts of the metro area. We're not the study we did last year didn't really focus on a lot of those downstream metro issues. So it does make sense that, you know, the analysis generally stopped there. There's a point to be made here, which is that a lot of the lines in this study do facilitate resource access. So we're not saying that these are the only ones, but this is a fairly obvious group. And there's some trade-offs and some dependencies here. So when you start looking at this area of the system, you know, it does take some thoughtful consideration of phasing and staging of these upgrades. And we also note that I think, you know, some of them are more feasible than others in certain ways. I think that one perspective, the fact that there's resource access in this area kind of gives a clear commercial driver, but also the fact that there's, you know, a lot of joint ownership of the transmission line also complicates the development opportunity. So that's for example, some of the factors that are weighed and traded off in the scoring analysis that we did of these projects.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Keegan, there's just seems to be a lot more interest on the Eastern Plains in terms of resources, especially with regard to wind. We recognize that all the projects enable, you know, resource development to some extent, but this has just always been an area that, you know, we've recognized as having potential for more generation. Some of you may remember a project many years ago, date myself, called the Eastern Plains Transmission Project. Had some similarities here. We used to call it kind of a backwards E, where we were trying to build a backbone around that eastern side and then feed it towards the Front Range. In this case, the picture we have is more of a backwards F. The CPP does enable some of that, but we found that there would be benefits to, you know, providing more transmission from the east side to the Front Range.
Great. Last one here, and this theme is interesting. This theme number 5. If you go to the next slide, Matt, this is the West Slope backbone, I talked about CETA having to weigh, different strategies and priorities for the state. I would probably put this one into the bucket as sort of, long range vision, right? Where this area of the system didn't come up in our work, at least, as a pressing need, certainly not on this scale, right? But it didn't take much, right? It definitely took some scenario analysis, but ultimately we did see either higher levels of resource deployment in this part of the state, coupled with or standalone with additional load deployment. In both cases, we saw an arising need for this type of expansion, which is really revisioning of this Western backbone that, coupled with some of the other concepts, could potentially do a lot and kind of emphasizing opportunities in the West Slope portion of the state. So these are all scored. You'll see these in the workbook as well. And so again, represents another opportunity for the board to weigh. Tom, if you want to add on this one, you can wrap up after this.
Yeah, no, I think this has always been an area we're starting to see more and more interest on the West Slope, especially with the retirement of Craig and Hayden. There's a lot of interest in the Four Corners area. This is also a good building block if you were to do this and do the west to east kind of transmission. And so there's a lot of opportunity. There's some existing corridors there. There's just a single 345 and single 230 over there now. So I think this would be one of those legacy type projects, very long term.
Yeah. So with that, just to kind of circle back to some of my opening comments, Maury, I'll pass it back to you. But the reason we're kind of have compiled a new map and bundled some of these is to really try to support two things. The map and these bundles and themes should help the CETA board kind of see where some of these projects are consistent with each other, maybe where some of them are supportive of each other, where they're geographically diverse, where they're diverse in cost and scope. And then also the scoring coupled with that should, I think, provide one perspective, ours, on their value, I think, based off of the set of criteria we used. So we hope that those two things combined can position the board well to make the choices it has to make going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Keegan and Tom. I want the board and the stakeholders to know the tremendous amount of time and effort and work that went into developing the scorecard and developing these new maps and really the thoughtful consideration of these projects. This is going to go a long way to helping the board have a meaningful conversation about these projects. So thank you, Keegan. Thank you, Tom. If you go to the next slide, Matt, I did want to take some time just to make sure that we have accurately framed the board's decision-making here. Again, the project scorecard and the project maps, I think, are best thought of as tools that can inform board selection of a project shortlist, right? As Keegan said, the scorecard and the maps don't provide a single answer. The board is going to have to exercise its judgment to find a best fit shortlist for CETA. The project shortlist, the best way to think about the project shortlist is that it's a signal to potential partners that CETA is interested in conducting further due diligence on these projects, right? Again, we're very early in the conceptual thinking about these projects. We have an awful lot of due diligence that we need to do going forward. And so we're signaling to potential partners that we're interested in these projects, and hopefully there's some overlap and we find some partners and are able to investigate these projects further. Another really important thing to remember is that projects that do not make the short list are not excluded from further consideration by CETA. As Keegan said earlier, if a developer looks at one of the projects on the list and thinks that a project that did not make the short list but is on our list is really important, and they were to come forward and say, hey, would CETA be willing to have a consideration about that project, we would not say, oh no, we excluded it, it's not on the short list, right? we would introduce them to our partnership development committee, and we'd start to have further conversations about those projects. So it's not excluding any projects. We're just sort of elevating certain projects in the hope that we can identify potential partners. I want to reemphasize what I think Keegan did an excellent job of talking about throughout his presentation, which is I think it's really important for the board to focus on emerging concepts, the categories that Keegan and Tom have created for us in terms of, San Luis Valley and east-west capacity. That would be one concept. System connectors is another concept. Think about those concepts when you're adding projects to a potential shortlist, but also think about potential strategies. As Keegan was saying, there's some projects here that are relatively short in terms of line miles, relatively inexpensive in terms of cost. They could be part of a sort of an early win strategy for CETA. There's other projects on here that, jump ahead considerably into the future. I'm thinking about the West Slope Backbone project, where you're really thinking the strategy there might be trying to, leave a meaningful legacy for future generations in Colorado. But I think it's important to talk about those strategies. I also think it's important to talk about the potential partners that come along with these various projects, right? CETA is interested in partnering with incumbent utilities, independent transmission developers, and others. And so, think about which projects might attract which kind of partners, and think strategically about that question as well. So again, I want to echo Keegan's recommendation, which is the board can select a diversity of projects and concepts for its shortlist, and I would suggest that they think strongly about doing that. If you go to the next slide for me, Matt, we'll talk about next steps. So the material, the scorecard and the maps is posted on CETA's website, and so stakeholders should have that available to them. We're going to open up a written comment period, and we're really interested in hearing from everyone about which projects should be added to a CETA shortlist, and importantly, why. What's your rationale for why CETA should focus on the projects that you're recommending? We're also interested in hearing your thoughts on whether or not this prioritization framework is useful and should be used again in the future. And if you have suggestions for improving it, our ears are open. So we're hoping that you can provide comments by June 26th. We'll take the comments that we receive and we'll take them under consideration. And I'm going to write a executive director recommendation to the board. I'm going to factor in the work that Keegan and Tom have done. I'm going to factor in the written comments that we receive, and I'll be making a recommendation to the board on a potential short list. Of course, the board can modify my recommendation by adding or subtracting projects. I'm going to make my recommendation available by July 7th. We'll post it on the CETA website. And then we're hoping that there might be a possibility that we can make sense of all this. I know it's a very complex undertaking, but if everything aligns right, there's a potential that the board could select a short list at its board meeting on July 10th. And so that's our target date for a board selection of a short list. Of course, if it proves to be more complicated and we need more time, then we can always extend the deadline for board selection of a shortlist. So there's the timeline. I encourage you all to consider submitting comments. Looking forward to hearing what people have to say. I think the next slide is just simply a thank you slide with my contact information. If you have any questions about the scorecard or about the maps or about the process, you don't have to. You can reach out anytime in the next 3 weeks and ask me those questions prior to submitting your comments. So feel free to reach out, contact me, have a conversation about things that you might be puzzled about or might be confusing. See if you can get those answered prior to submitting your comments. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Kathy Boys and Steve Black, who are going to help facilitate some conversations here. So Kathy, back to you.
Thank you, Maury. Thank you, Keegan and Tom. And I'm going to hand it to Steve for this next portion.
Thank you, Kathy. So we have about 30, 35 minutes. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so thanks for that. And thanks for the presentation, Keegan and Tom, and Maury. We're going to spend those first 30 minutes for Q&A from the members of the board. I think most of the board is represented today, so please raise your hand so that I can recognize you. And Leah, as the board chair, I'm going to start with you and ask if you want to make any initial comments or ask the first question.
Thanks, Steve. Mostly I just want to start by thanking you, Kathy, and the team that has done so much work in both the initial study and then this prioritization process for your work. We're really grateful to have your support in this collaboration, and also really grateful for some of the visualizations that you were able to put together to explain the themes. But I want to defer to some of the other board members with their questions because I see Roger has his hand up.
Great, thank you. Roger.
Thanks, Leah, and thanks to everybody for their wonderful work. I echo all the sentiments about the amount of time and effort put into it. I think you flagged that the spread between the projects was fairly tight given the scoring. We've talked extensively about it being just a screening tool, and there's plenty of opportunities for introduction of other projects. Given the short and very positive and ambitious timeline we have for this next phase in the selection process, are we thinking there'll be a formal process during the next month by which those that didn't make the initial screening test will be vetted and put into the queue for our board meeting in July? In other words, as folks comment and are thinking about highlighting other projects, maybe it'd be helpful to talk just a little bit about whether there'll be any kind of nomination process. I know many of us have been on boards with spreadsheets and scoring, and then there's some sort of like advocacy or nomination where board members actually get into that process. So sorry for the long question, but I think it's important to try to splay out how we're going to do this in the next 6 weeks.
Maury, I'll turn to you.
Well, so I'm thinking I'm hearing two kinds of questions there, Roger. So one is can stakeholders suggest projects be added to the list that were not included in the study? And so the answer to that question is we're always willing to hear about projects from stakeholders. We have a partnership development committee that meets regularly and is active in considering projects. If you have a project that was not included in our study, was not included in our project scorecard ranking, please reach out to myself, and I'll introduce you to the Partnership Development Committee, and we will have a conversation about whether that project should be discussed by the full CETA board. And we're happy to do that, where we encourage people to do that. But we're not going to add it in at this late date to the scorecard analysis and the ranking. So we're not going to be adding projects to the equation between now and the 26th. Now, board, I think I also heard in there, Roger, that you're suggesting that board members can and others, stakeholders can recommend certain projects move to the top or move up and down the list. I don't think, at least we're not interested in, I'm not interested in debating the final scores here. The projects that are on the short list don't all have to be the top 5 projects, right? The scorecard and the maps and the concepts are for board discussion. They're there to help inform the board. If the board wants to select a short list that is the first project, the second project, the 7th project, and the 9th project, that's part of their discretion. They have the ability to do that, and they just need to articulate why those projects are selected and why they're on the short list. We don't need to go back and reverse engineer the scorecard and the ranking and all of that.
Great.
So Roger, did I come close to answering your question?
Kind of. I mean, everything you said, I think, had been covered except for this. And my point was the last one. And maybe it's for us as a board and Leah, for you to put some time into how in this very short time frame are we going to be nominating, if you will, or, using the flexibility you've identified, Maury, to do this? Is there going to be a process through which we do exactly what you've described, Maury, and go beyond the top 10 and really look at how the comments, come in and how we then integrate those into this very, important decision we make in early July?
So we need to be careful that the CETA board makes decisions in public, in public meetings. We have to avoid inadvertent, email meetings and inadvertent public meetings. And so, again, what I'm hoping to do is put out my executive director recommendation on July 7th. And if the board members want to reach out to me individually, one-on-one between now and then, or even after the written comments come in, that's fine. Again, I will share my summary of the written comments on July 7th. We will hold a board meeting on July 10th, and that's where the conversation will take place, Roger. If we need more time, and we may, like I said, we can always start the discussion on July 10th and then schedule a follow-on meeting for further discussions and decisions. But I think it's really important that we do this, have this conversation in public. And so what I would encourage board members to do is reach out to me by email or give me a call, share your thoughts, share your strategies, share how you approach this, and I'll try and incorporate it into my recommendation, and then we can have a further conversation on July 10th.
Great, thank you. I do have to leave it too, so I wanted to get my comments in quickly. That covers them. Thanks. That transparency is critical. And I do recommend we make sure we have at least 2 hour, if not more, board meeting on the 10th to make sure we have the time to vet this. Thank you, Maury.
Thank you, Roger. Leah?
Yeah, Roger, I just kind of want to build on what Maury just shared is we are going to have this opportunity for the members of the public and interested stakeholders to share their feedback on the results of the prioritization, as well as their thoughts and suggestions on things that we take into consideration or do as part of the next step of our down selection process. And then, as Maury indicated, he's going to, in addition to reviewing all of the comments we receive from the public and stakeholders, offer his recommendations for the board to consider in picking that shortlist. Roger, what I think would be helpful for you, and if other board members feel similarly, if there is an additional process step beyond the public comment and the recommendations of the executive director that you think the board should be considering, it would be good to hear that, or to sort of submit that for consideration for us to take into advisement when we discuss this on the 10th.
Great. I don't see other hands, but I'm sure there are other board members with questions. Ron Lair, thank you.
Yeah, I didn't want you to feel ignored and alone, Steve. Couple of questions on the presentation. First, thanks a lot for the new maps. Those are very helpful. I think there's a great opportunity to continue to provide better visuals than what we've had. So, but three sorts of questions arise out of the presentation from Keegan and Tom. One is regarding Tote 3. Can you discuss the hair on the project there without mentioning the Western Area Power Administration?
Keegan?
Tom, do you want to take that one?
Or Tom?
Yeah, just the fact that that's a WEC path, and they're just going through the rating process alone. I know that there's a lot just in changing the WEC rating, all the entities involved, and then the allocation of that path just historically has been, another hurdle to go through.
Okay. Second one on the west slope backbone concept. Do we face a trade-off between that project and connecting to New Mexico farther east, or would both of them be in prospect? And in what scenario does that Western Slope backbone arise? You said it came out of the study work, but can you pin that down? What the condition of future facts would justify that, and does it trade off with the concepts that you showed further east?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a trade-off. They're kind of two different projects. What drove that Western backbone were more of a high demand scenario when we ran the higher load, and then we also ran a sensitivity of adding more resources on the Western Slope. And so if you find that parties are more interested in developing generation up in that northwest area around Craig Hayden, we understand there's going to be some retirements, but there's been a lot of interest in not just replacing what's already there, but building even more. And there's a lot of interest in getting into the Four Corners area. And so those combined, provide the drivers for that Western Slope backbone.
Yeah, and that's not just Colorado demand, that's regional demand. That's the load center in the LA basin is calling out when we're talking about getting across Tote 2. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of parties there.
Yeah. Last question. It seems to me that we've got concepts that go west with a connection to Pacific Core. We've got north with the Tote 3 work. We got two ideas that go south. We've got no ideas that go east. Can you remind me why getting across the interties to the eastern interconnection isn't on our radar anywhere?
Well, it's a separate system to the east. Right now it's connected with DC ties. As part of the scenarios we did look at some delivery from SPP into Colorado across the ties and evaluated what that might entail in terms of Colorado upgrades. But we also mentioned that we didn't dig too far into what it would take to actually modify the DC ties to make that happen. And so, the existing ties are, around 200, 250 megawatts capacity. If you're thinking about the kind of resources that might be delivered, could be a more expensive prospect if you're trying to add more DC ties or upgrade the ties that are already there, and just having to partner with, those on the eastern side of the system.
Okay, those are my questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ron. Carl.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, Ron's asking questions stimulated my thinking that we are going to likely have more questions. And Maury mentioned that we don't want to be deliberating in not in public, but I'm wondering when is a good time for us board members to, Maury, to hit you up with clarifying and sort of, filling out questions like Ron asked and others that some of us may have. You want us to do that in response to your memo? Should we do it now? What's the best thing for an orderly process here?
The sooner the better. So,
Okay.
we've had, so we had some preliminary discussions with the standing committees about how to frame this. We've now had today's study session. If you have questions along the lines that Ron Lair was just asking, and you need to get them answered to help you inform your discussion on July 10th, ask them sooner rather than later. If I know them, I'll try and provide the answer. If I have to go to Keegan and Tom to get the answer, I'll attempt to do that. And then I'll try and figure out a way to socialize the answers, right? So that all the board members get to see all the other board members' questions and deliberations. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you think about it, it's a good thing. We need to do this deliberation in public, and so I think that's how we'll do it. If you can ask any questions that you have as soon as you can, and I will try and socialize the answers so that all the board members can see them. And we'll see if we can also get those posted on the website somehow. Just makes it a little bit
Yeah,
We are
something
a
like
small shop, so try not
something
to.
like a Google spreadsheet or something where you just enter questions
Yeah.
as they come in and provide some responses. I don't want to overwhelm you with it. I just thought that, rather than waiting until the final decision, if there's something, oh, hey, what about this? And then, okay, that answers my question. Now I know where I stand on that project.
Yep.
Thanks. That's it.
Thank you, Carl. I don't see hands. Don't be shy. I know this is a complicated exercise, lots of layers. Keegan and Tom have done a great job, and Maury, but it's not straightforward. So now is the time. Ron, thank you. Ron, you're still on mute.
Oh, yeah, Ron.
We need a partnership with a willing developer, or hopefully more than one, and they are finite in number and pretty well known because they make themselves known. Do we have an assessment of their priorities? How do they set their priorities? And does this exercise that we've been working through, does it reflect what the developers do in their work? Are we in consonance with our prospective partners here, or have we thought about that?
So Ron, there's a number of incumbent utilities and independent transmission developers that are participating in today's call. The Partnership Development Committee over the last year and a half has met with many of the people that I see, at least many of the organizations that I see represented on the call today. We encourage the incumbent utilities, we encourage independent transmission developers to participate in our open window here and submit written comments and share their thoughts with us. And if there's reluctance to do that in a public forum, again, we have a partnership development committee that is set up to allow developers to approach us and have conversations with a subset of the board. And so I encourage them to do that as well.
So with that, can I assume that none of them have approached us? Is that where we are?
No. So again, we've met with 3 or 4 independent transmission developers, have had conversations about projects. We just have not gotten to the stage where we've entered into a formal partnership agreement, but the Partnership Development Committee has met with 3 or 4 different entities. And so we're aware of, I'm aware of some overlap between projects that we have identified in our study and projects that we have discussed with potential partners. We just haven't advanced to the stage where we're having detailed conversations about partnerships.
Okay, so I'll take that as being we're generally, given what you've learned from those conversations, we're probably not too far off in terms of what we're doing here. We're not heading down some blind alley or short trail off a large cliff, right?
There is some overlap.
Okay.
If I might interject, we also, Ron, keep in mind in the prioritization criteria was the commercial viability factor, and particularly the theme on the system connectors. Keegan and Tom, I don't know if you might want to offer some of the trade-off there of their short, less expensive projects, but the commercial viability is a question. So it was considered as through some of the prioritization work.
Okay, thank you.
Keegan or Tom, do you want to add to that or respond to that question?
I think Kathy got it right, is that we did consider the contractability of some of these upgrades. One of the things that's difficult in this type of transmission planning is you do not necessarily, have a kind of incumbent load through which to recover your costs. And so it's not obvious how to address that. But at the same time, CETA and organizations like CETA are created to do something new and to innovate to some extent on these business models. So we didn't want to over bias towards that, Ron, by just saying, oh, this project's not for the deliberation of generation, so there's no way for it to get contracted, right? That would be the easy way for us to screen these projects down, but we did not do that. But it was considered in a more nuanced way.
Okay, Kathy, I might yield 15 minutes. If there are no further questions from the board, we'll hand it back to Kathy for questions from stakeholders and others on the call.
Sure. Okay. And board members, by all means, if it prompts something, come forward as we get into public comment here. So we will turn to the next portion of our session, hearing from stakeholders. And I'm going to reiterate what we've already heard from Maury previously, that we are not looking for formal comments today. This is a chance for you to ask questions, seek clarifications, and perhaps provide some initial reactions. If you have ideas or thoughts that you want the board members to hear, now is a good chance for that. So please raise your Zoom hand. I'll call on speakers in turn. We do ask that you keep your comments to a reasonable length as we have a full house today. Christine, thank you for your patience. Appreciate your holding off, and we'll open the floor to you, please.
Oh, thank you. First, I just wanted to thank everyone. This has been, I know this has been a long process, and I just feel like it's been very thorough, and hopefully, we're an advocacy organization, so obviously we're going to try and encourage people to provide comments. But I was wondering, is there going to be a PowerPoint? Is this PowerPoint going to be available and it's going to be on the website? Did you say that? And I just didn't hear it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's okay. You're not the only one that has asked for that. So all the materials, the project scorecard, the maps, the slide deck, all of it is posted on the CETA website right now. So the only thing we'll post later is the recording and probably an attendee list. So everything is there for you.
Because people are going to need some guidance. So thank you.
Yep. No, and we know that the spreadsheet is tough to read. So it is there for you to download and magnify. Anything else, Christine, before I move on?
No, that does it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We appreciate your participation today. Dan, and then I'm going to go to Chris next.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dan Greenberg. I'm an advisor at the Public Utilities Commission. I want to echo Christine's comments. Great work getting to this point. Very exciting and fascinating. A little bit off today's agenda, but I wanted to mention that there has been advocacy in the ongoing just transition solicitation, the resource solicitation process that's been going on for Excel, Public Service Colorado. Advocacy for looking into financing of transmission via CETA. And so, and I know that I remember that several months ago, probably more than that, Ron Lair had brought that up, or maybe his comments were in some preliminary work for a rulemaking. But in any case, I'm curious about the timeline for setting up CETA's financing capabilities for your the projects that you select internally, and whether that might potentially be available for utility built projects.
So Dan, we're aware of the testimony. We've actually seen the rebuttal testimony as well. If you're interested in finding out CETA's priorities and how we intend to use our limited budget, the best way to do that would be join us for our board meeting a week from today. So on June 12th, the CETA has a scheduled board meeting to consider its state fiscal year 26 budget. And you'll see that we have prioritized two efforts in the next state fiscal year. One is to develop policy around our public notification process for when we select a single project and put it out for public notification. And then the second priority is developing and perfecting that public financing authority, that revenue bonding authority. And so if we're able to use our funds wisely over the course of the next state fiscal year. I'm hoping that we can start a discussion around developing our public financing authority maybe in January of 2026. It'll be in the second half of the next state fiscal year when we get to the public financing authority. If we're lucky, we'll get that completed by July of 2026. So that gives you some sense of when we plan on tackling that and when it might be done.
Great, thank you, appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you, Dan. We appreciate your participation. And yeah, Steve dropped into the chat. When you come on, if you could please identify yourself and your organization as well. So I'll turn to Chris, please.
Hi, Chris Gilden with Tri-State GNT. Question about with the SPP RTO right around the corner, less than a year. Of the 36 projects, 25 are within the SPP RTO. Is there value in shortlisting those projects rather than, say, put them into a holding pattern and waiting for SPP to complete their ITP process and their needs assessment, and then seeing if there's value there?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. We've had a couple preliminary conversations with the people at SPP about the engagement of CETA and SPP once the RTO is effective and in place. We understand that there's some work that they have to do on their side to, evaluate the new footprint here in the Western interconnection. They need to do some studies. And then we look for some potential overlap between the projects that CETA might be interested in, the projects that SPP might be interested in. And again, CETA might have a role to play in helping to advance some projects that SPP might identify. So I'm not sure that it makes a big difference as to whether the projects are put on the short list or sort of put on a list that's sort of a holding list for them. In terms of CETA moving forward, I think there's very little difference there, but if I'm missing something, I'm all ears.
Thank you. I'll turn to Brian.
Great. Hi, folks. Thanks for the presentation today. Really great stuff. Glad to see this project, the overall study moving forward in the prioritization. I do have a question regarding the interregional projects. And just to start off, Brian Turner, Advanced Energy United. Sorry, I forgot that. So very glad to see the interregional projects receiving analysis and prioritization. I think, we've got multiple studies that show interregional connections for Colorado being absolutely essential to reaching policy goals around 100% clean and reliability goals, extreme events being a significant concern. We know they're extreme, but unfortunately not rare. And Colorado really needs to build up those connections for both affordability and reliability. And I was glad to see the Craig to Coyote project receive a high prioritization. And my question is about the utility involvement, the Colorado Coordinated Planning Group involvement in this prioritization so far. And in that, I want to note that in the JTS, the current Public Service Just Transition Solicitation, there is a study of the Craig to Little Snake substation. So very similar project from a reliability standpoint, and whether CETA, whether Energy Strategies had access to that study, whether that figured into the prioritization here, and that as a component of the larger question of what kind of coordination has already occurred with the utilities and the Colorado Coordinated Planning Group.
Thank you, Brian. So let's start with maybe the quicker one first. The second question, the Craig to Little Snake project study that's appearing in the Just Transition solicitation. Keegan and Tom, can you answer for us? Was that that recent study a factor in the prioritization work?
I don't think any study was a factor. The things that factored into the score was the scoring criteria. So I'll just say that. But things that were factors in the transmission planning study done that led into this list of projects, Brian, were the fact that this project concept has popped up in a couple forums. We didn't originate the idea, probably augmented it a little bit in the way we wanted to for this study. So is it coordinated, in that fashion? Yes. So it was kind of inspired by other work that had gone on.
Thank you. And then the larger question of the level of utility involvement and addressing the Colorado Coordinated Planning Group, that the subset transmission providers in the state. Maury?
Yeah, I mean, we attend CCPG meetings and all of that, but Brian, I think what you're getting at is that that's part of the further due diligence that comes with identifying a project, putting it on the short list, right? If we put a project on a short list, we will actively be reaching out to potential partners, potential groups, West Connect, Colorado Coordinated Planning Group, trying to, do our own due diligence and try to, learn about whether or not those projects are feasible moving forward. And so, I think that's yet to come. It's, somebody raised the issue of, cost recovery earlier. We're gonna have to engage with those entities, those regional transmission planning entities, those coordination groups, if we're going to build a coalition of people that see value in the project, see benefits in the project, and are willing to, sign up for cost recovery. So that's sort of the due diligence that is in front of us, not behind us.
Okay, that's really helpful because I see that as a rationale for moving forward, frankly, on a project that has substantial work done already by those other organizations. Then if that coordination is the next step, kind of speaks to why it'd be helpful to move forward to that next step and see how much this project has already been scoped.
Yep, those kinds of comments in the written comment period would be helpful. And I know that Chris, in answering your question earlier, if I'm missing something on the SPP engagement, some suggestions on how best to do that would be helpful in those written comments. So that's why we're opening the written comment window. Help inform us about, how to move forward with some of these projects.
Thank you, Brian. Rebecca, I see your hand up, and then Pam, I'll go to you next. Thanks for your patience.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. And so this is Rebecca Johnson. I'm with WAPA, and we are, of course, one of the entities that's heavily engaged in the SPP RTO expansion into the Western Interconnection. And so tying back to the conversation that was just before Brian's points, I just want to note that one of the key objectives of the RTO expansion is to enable transmission development. And so entities can certainly bring projects to the SPP ITP, and we encourage stakeholders to do so. It was a big part of our intention in RTO development to create opportunities versus barriers. And so I just wanted to highlight that. I don't want anybody to see the RTO expansion as potentially problematic. I think that it could create a great deal of opportunity. So no question, just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Pam.
Hey, hi, I'm Pam Eaton. I'm a consultant based in Boulder. My organization is Green West Strategies. And I just wanted to have a couple of clarifying questions. One, on the San Luis Valley project, it sounded like the project coming out of the valley was maybe a placeholder and not a single project. And I just wanted to understand that issue. And then similarly with the Tote 3 and Coyote, it sounded like they were almost trade-offs there between those two. That Tote 3 is so hard, but you could do the other project. So I just wanted to get a little bit of clarification on those two. And then I also wanted to say that I really appreciated the presentation of these themes. And that made it a lot easier to understand and sort of think about these in a clearer way. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. So let's start with the first one, the San Luis Valley as a placeholder. Keegan and Tom, hand it over to you for that.
Yeah, I could answer that one, and good to see you, Pam. The thing I'd say about the San Luis Valley actually applies to all of these projects, right? So we're calling them project concepts at this time. And one of the reasons that we're doing that is really the project is meeting a need. It's serving a purpose. And right now we have an idea of what that might look like. But in transmission development, what is typically done is, you'll sort of identify this need, identify an initial answer to that need, but then you do what's called a alternatives analysis. And for all of these projects, that alternatives analysis has not been done, right? And would be done by CETA and a partner in the future to say that, hey, we've worked with the community that's affected here, the local planning entities, we've done all these things, and this is the outcome that makes the most sense. That's especially true with the San Luis Valley because we're all aware of the different options. But we did have to study one for the purposes of doing the analysis we did last year. And so that's why that shows, SLV alternatives is it's kind of representative of all of those. Unfortunately, not all these projects have kind of a snappy name like that, but I would think of them all the same way, right? Where we've identified an initial answer, but all these initial answers are subject to the diligence that Maury mentioned, but also this alternatives assessment that I mentioned. The reason that's not done now is, I would say, from a technical perspective, like it's just as much scope as all the work we just did summarizing this. So it would not make sense to do alternative studies for all the projects on the list right now. As for Tote 3 and Coyote, Tom, why don't you answer that one?
I wouldn't think of those as so much of a trade-off. It's just they're both opportunities to do, interstate type projects. Same with going to New Mexico. They just have varying degrees of what we'd call implementation or constructability. They all have their own unique advantages. It's just, whatever CETA would decide would be a higher priority or maybe a better path, again, depending on what kind of developers would be interested in assisting with any of those.
And I'll just recognize the comment in the chat here from Chris. Tri-State Coyote to Craig will not be easy. It will likely involve WEC path studies of Gateway South and West, Tote 1, Tote 5, and potentially Tote 3. Definitely an interstate concept.
None of them are, none of them are easy.
Yeah.
Just to go back
you.
to this, to the Valley, that's another one where I think, back to Brian's point, we're well aware of what CCPG has done. They've done San Luis Valley studies for years. And so they've, looked at all the different alternatives as well. So that's one where we have, kind of leveraged the information that's out there.
Thank you, Tom. Pam, anything further before I move on?
No, that's super helpful. I guess I would ask, just when you present it with this connection to those other lines, it creates a different way of thinking also about the potential benefits of that that line, so, or that route. So that's it's an interesting construction. So
yeah, thank you, Pam. And as Keegan offered earlier, the staging and sequencing of some of these projects are interdependent. Tyler,
Kathy, and one other point on the San Luis Valley. Alamosa County was awarded a TSED grant, a Transmission Security and Economic Development grant, to study alternative routes in the valley. I'm scheduled to be on the advisory committee for that study. That study has not been formally canceled. I think it's just in limbo. I don't think the current administration knows what to do with it yet. But part of our thinking is that Alamosa County would study those alternative routes in that study and hopefully land on a preferred route that we could then work with them on. So and I haven't heard that study has been canceled, although I haven't heard anything in several months either.
This is Chris real quick. I'm sorry, Tyler, but I just wanted to respond to that, Maury, because I actually talked with the Alamosa County Commissioner, Lori Lasky, who has been really pushing, and she says that it's absolutely still on the plate, but they have not heard or been removed. So it is in limbo, but it has not been removed. So.
Yep. So again, hopefully, that gets restarted, right? And they get the funding and they're able to hire a consultant and they're able to take a look. They were going to study 3 separate routes, one to the north, one to the east, one to the south. And we were hoping that they would, help do some of that alternatives analysis that Keegan was talking about.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Christine. Tyler.
Hi, everyone. Tyler Farrell, manager at RMI. Nice to see everyone again, and great job with today's presentation. I hope these will be two relatively quick questions, but the first part of my question is just a clarifying question that these new themes are great, and I love them. I'm curious, is CETA's intention, especially certain themes, that there's a world maybe where CETA might be choosing a theme to pursue instead of individual lines? Yeah, I'm hearing Murray shake his head, so maybe I'll let you respond there.
Yeah, no, I think we want to select the projects that are on the project list. If the reason for selecting them or the justification for selecting them is that one of the themes rises to the top, then I think that's good. But we're not generically selecting themes. We're putting projects on a short list.
Okay, well, that's great to know, especially to help inform comments after this meeting. The second question I have is about that sequencing that Keegan brought up, and kind of relates to this in that I see a lot of these projects as you can't pursue certain projects without other projects kind of being coupled into that, and how CETA intends to kind of deal with that sequencing, or kind of, yeah, just deal with that sequencing as far as prioritizing projects.
Well, we're aware of some important sequencing, and that might factor in, my recommendations to the board. I'm sure the board is aware of some sequencing. So for example, if the northern route out of the San Luis Valley was chosen, getting to Poncha is only half of the problem, right?
Yeah.
That Poncha to Midway would be an important sequence, right? That would need to be completed to realize the full benefits of the San Luis Valley line. So, how you think about that and how you would recommend projects be added to the short list, that's what we're looking for in the written comments. That would be really helpful, Tyler, if you can talk about project sequencing, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And that was the exact project that I was thinking about, especially given how those projects have risen to the top of the scorecard. So thanks, Maury, and thanks for the time. I'll give it back to Kathy.
Thank you. Leah? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to build on Mari's response about the themes. I think we are interested to hear, Tyler, from you and other folks in your comments, the value of us thinking about in the projects we prioritize, having more than one of these themes represented in the priority list. So that's something that we're definitely considering, because the study showed these kind of thematic areas and thematic needs. Does it make sense if we're picking 5 priority projects to have more than one theme represented? So your comments on that point would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I plan to.
Thank you, Tyler. We look forward to it. I don't see other hands. I know there's been a little bit in the chat back and forth about the Little Snake substation. Feel free to put your hand up if you want to clarify on that, and I'll turn to Brian.
So I've got another question, if that's all right. Staying on the interregional theme, which again, I really appreciate that emerging as a theme here. I wanted to ask about both the Western Slope project and the North Yuma to Stiegel, I don't know how it's pronounced, projects, which the Western Slope that extends down to Shiprock, and then the North Yuma to Stiegel project that goes up into Nebraska. Those I would assume also increase interregional transfer capability. Why or how would you, this is for energy strategies or Maury, why don't those also then be featured under an interregional theme, or is there not increased interregional transfer capability with those projects?
Tom, do you want to take that one?
So there is a potential for interregional capacity. We didn't make, evaluating that capacity a focus other than kind of identifying what those projects were. If that was to be, a focus for CETA, then that would be another next step, would be really understanding what, those type of projects would provide. I think, Chris Gilden mentioned, any kind of an interregional project is going to take a lot of additional detailed study work. And so we were just trying to identify what some of those concepts were rather than kind of quantify the actual capacity that they might provide on a interregional basis.
Okay, so in our written comments, for instance, we could highlight those projects as potentially also fitting under the interregional theme if that was something that the board wanted to pursue as a theme.
Yes, Brian, I think the board is eager to hear your thoughts and perspectives on the different lines and the benefits that they bring to the state.
Great.
Thank you. Carl, we'll return to you and then to Lisa.
Yep. This is kind of oblique to this, but it plays on everything that I've been hearing, and that is that I want to make sure, I guess my preference would be that we make sure that we facilitate comments in the most effective way. And it seems like I've heard, or not seems like, I know we'd like general comments, what's round 2 looking like, things, where how do we improve this process? Other stuff. Here's a project that didn't make it on your list, but I'd like you to think about. Then there are sort of tiers of specificity. This project should be blah 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 because it's down the road. And I guess I'm calling on Maury and Kathy and you guys all working together on this to help people be focused and get the highest value out of their comments by indicating what they're speaking on and having, in some places we're going to have time limits. We really need these comments by this in order to facilitate informing this process. But we'll also always have a bucket where comments can go and they can help us make systemic changes or modifications in the process. Anyway, so I guess it's just I guess it's a flip back to like I said, to Maury, Kathy, the team. Let's help people be very specific, maybe even if we give guidelines for good comments. Please please indicate the subject of your comment at the very top or something like that, so that a very good and specific comment doesn't get lost in the big bucket full of general comments and vice versa. So anyway, because I'm really thrilled by the level of engagement that we're getting from people, but I want to make sure we maximize the value they're able to get out of their engagement.
So
Carl, on slide 16 in the deck that we walked through, there's some suggested questions there for stakeholders to respond to. And that first question in particular is the ones that I think is the one that would be most helpful. Which projects should the CETA board consider adding to its short list of projects? And most importantly, why? What's the rationale for it? Is it a thematic rationale? Is it a strategy rationale? Is it a commercial viability rationale? But focus on the projects. Tell us which ones seem like the best fit to you and why. And then, if you cover that base and you check that box, then beyond that, it's all gravy to us, right? We'll take your thoughts on other subjects and other matters, but it would be really helpful to hear from people which projects they think rise to the top and help the board fight through that. So that would be my suggestion to people: focus on which projects and why. Most importantly, why.
Thank you. And we'll share that slide here again so you can get the email address before we close. Thank you, Carl. Lisa.
Thank you, Kathy and board and Maury. I am speaking just independently as a consultant today. Just want to say I appreciate the work, but also that the last meeting I attended for the Western Slope Subcommittee of the CCPG, they suggested, hey, maybe that subcommittee would close up its books and disappear because of the transition to RTO West, and perhaps it wouldn't be needed. So I wanted to emphasize that those CCPG subcommittees and task forces, really all of them, should have more meaning now, at least to the extent that they might touch on the priorities listed in this report that will continue to be fleshed out further. And so I would urge Tri-State and WAPA representatives and anyone speaking to these subcommittees and that their value will continue, especially the Western Slope Subcommittee, which has a meeting next week. And so I'm hoping it'll continue, and I'll tell them that as well as putting it in written comments to this group. So they're more valuable even with that transition to RTO West rather than less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, we are well ahead of schedule. I know there's a lot of material in here, a lot of details, so I'll give it just a minute or two to see if other thoughts, board members want any comments to return to. Thank you, Matt. He just dropped the slide deck into the chat for you, so you can take a look at the details. Matt, then if I could ask you to pull up our slide 16, just to reiterate what's ahead. So to Carl's point, written comments, we recognize this is a significant amount of material and very delicate considerations. So we're giving full 3 weeks here, due June 26th. As Maury offered, the projects, 2 questions. Which projects should be added to CETA's shortlist and why? And then secondly, is the prioritization framework a useful tool for screening and ranking projects? Thinking, is this a durable framework that CETA should hang on to and consider in future work? And then Maury will develop a director recommendation that will be posted on the CETA website July 7th, and the CETA board will take it up at their July 10th meeting. Ron.
Yeah, just on this, what's going to happen next steps. What I know, Maury, that you've discussed with us some time for talking to potential partners, but then there's a notice. We're required to give notice that we're going to take up a project. Can you remind me when we might, in a world that's better than this one, maybe when we might have that notice?
So the first thing we need to do, Ron, is we need to conduct a public process to develop the sort of the rulemaking for how we're going to go about initiating and conducting that public notification process. It needs to do 2 things. The public notification is intended to do 2 things. It's intended to allow the general public to question the need for the project and ask questions about the impacts of the project and make recommendations to the board on whether or not it's a good project, right? So there's that part of the public notification. The second part of the public notification is it allows incumbent utilities, independent transmission developers, and others to come forward and say that they're interested in developing that project, that they have the wherewithal to do it, and they can sort of step into our shoes and take over the project. But it has to be a good faith effort. And so what kind of demonstration must someone that's stepping into our shoes make to the CETA board to convince the CETA board that it is a good faith effort to develop the project and not just capture it? And so we need to initiate that policy making. We are running on financial fumes at the moment, but when January comes, we enter a new state fiscal year. And so, again, I encourage people to attend our board meeting next Thursday, where we're going to be talking about next year's budget. But the number one priority in my budget presentation will be developing that public notification policy, Ron. And I'm hoping that you know, if we're successful in this shortlist prioritization and we're successful in finding partners, the CETA board might be possibly prepared maybe a year from now to, you know, initiate that public notification process, but we have to develop it first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, all that rings bells with me, and I just was trying to get that because that's really a critical step, and I just wanted to make sure that I had the right expectation about when it might happen. So thank you.
Yep.
Maury, can I just do a clarification there on the financing situation for CETA? Is the next infusion in January or in July?
The next infusion, the state fiscal year, the current fiscal year ends June 30th. The new fiscal year starts July 1. So our funds refresh July 1st. And
Okay.
so we will, you know, again, the CETA board gets to decide the budget, gets to decide the priorities. My recommendations are that the public notification development of that policy be priority number one. That priority number two should be the public financing that Dan Greenberg brought up earlier, and that we try to sequence both of those in the next state fiscal year. It might be a little hard depending on how costly those efforts are to complete both of them in the next state fiscal year, but at least, you know, complete that first one in the next fiscal year and hopefully make significant progress on the public financing in the next state fiscal year. Those are two crucial policies for CETA to have in place if we're going to be effective.
Good, thank you. So notification policy, if all goes according to plan, should proceed in late summer.
Yep, we'll kick it off in July if all things go well.
Okay, thank you. All right, and Maury, I think I will hand it back to you for final comments, and then we'll go ahead and close the session.
All right, I just want to, again, thank Kathy, thank Steve for their excellent facilitation. I don't think anyone does it better. I want to thank Matt for helping run the slideshow and helping get all of this together and posted on the website. Thank you, Matt. I want to thank Keegan and Tom. They have put in an enormous amount of time to work on the scorecard and the ranking, but it goes well beyond that. Their thoughtful consideration of these projects has really informed my thinking on the projects, and I'm assuming it's also informing the board's thinking on the projects. I want to encourage the stakeholders on the call to take advantage of the public comment window that we're opening and submit public comments. And before I leave, I want to turn it over to our newly elected chair, Leah. Leah, do you have any last thoughts for anyone?
Again, just thank you to the team supporting us. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Your comments are a really important part of the record and what we'll be considering. So please, in addition to the sort of suggested prompts that are included in the slides, which are all available from the website, your feedback on the themes, on what really helps make important differences in the considerations of developers, what we may need to think about in terms of how we move projects forward once they're prioritized. Your comments on all of those things are helpful to us, and we appreciate your participation in this process. That's it. Thanks, Maury. Thanks, everyone.
And with that, we'll go ahead and adjourn and hand you 20 minutes back. Thank you, everybody.